It's 2008, and Tasmania is in a state of prolonged and deepening drought. The island, which usually produces abundant hydroelectric power, is relying heavily on the power grid of mainland Australia. The infrastructure that makes this transfer of energy possible is a remarkable feat of engineering. A high-voltage direct current interconnector, and the commission of this submarine power cable, only 2 years previously, could not have come at a more critical time. Electricity generated in the power stations of Victoria leaves the Australian mainland in a state-of-the-art power cable buried deep below the sands of McGowan's Beach, and begins a journey of nearly 300 kilometres south beneath the turbulent waters of Bass Strait. For over 200 years, submarine power cables have been supplying electricity to remote outposts, linking existing terrestrial power grids to improve overall efficiency, and importantly, allowing trade of energy between previously isolated markets.
The peak load in the UK of a morning will be at a different time to the peak load in Europe because of the time difference. So you can actually then transfer power between those regions to cover those peak loads.
The very first underwater power cable was laid across the Isar River in Bavaria, and the first high-voltage DC link started operation in 1954, linking Gotland Island to mainland Sweden.
At the moment, the deepest cable, which I think goes down to 1,600 metres, is between Sardinia and Italy. The longest cable is between Norway and the Netherlands, the Norned cable.
The cable crossing the Strait of Messina is tested by an exceptionally energetic environmental setting, rivaling those found half a world away in Australasia, and the Basslink cable is currently the planet's second longest. Technological advancements during the 20th century focused on improvements in the materials used for cable insulation.
This is mass-impregnated paper insulated cable. It's paper that's insulated with oil. It's wrapped around a solid copper core.
Alternating current, or AC transmission, is far more common than DC in terrestrial power networks today, partly due to the success of George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla in their famous rivalry with Thomas Edison in the late 19th century. However, three-phase AC requires 3 separate conductors and therefore produces 3 separate electromagnetic fields, which interact to produce inefficiencies in transmission. In submarine cables, this leads to the need for thicker conductors and more insulation, cables which ultimately are very expensive to produce. Because of these limitations of physics and economics, the transmission distance of a high-voltage AC submarine cable cannot exceed around 100 kilometers. DC, on the other hand, can achieve much longer transmission distances with a single, smaller, cheaper conductor cable.
HVDC was really coming to the fore in the 60s. 1965 saw the opening of the Cook Strait link in New Zealand.
It was the second DC inter-island link in the world. I'm pretty amazed at our forefathers in terms of their engineering ability. We've got hydro generation in the middle of the South Island. We've got a lot of it. But the load, the majority of people live in the North Island. So we need to get that power from the South Island to the North Island, and the HVDC link makes that possible.
In the mid-90s, the Tasmanian government set up the Basslink Development Board to say, well, let's look at building one of these things, let's look at the feasibility. We went through a 2-year environmental impact approvals process. Currently still is the largest ever environmental impact assessment for any project in Australia. And then in 2003 we started construction. The marine cable took 14 months to lay, and on the 28th of April 2006 Basslink went live. and has been trading in the market ever since. Tasmania has got an abundance of clean energy. It's all hydro, it's all wind. It's located on what they call the Roaring Forties, which is some of the best winds in the world for wind power. And what Basslink has allowed to happen is Tasmania is exporting green power when prices are high in Victoria, so it's bringing green power into the market. On the other side, during times of drought, 2008-2009, their reservoirs were pretty low, and what Basslink did was actually allow them to import a huge amount of electricity. 40% of all the electricity in Tasmania came through Basslink. If Basslink hadn't been there, it was very clear that there would have been blackouts in Tasmania, there would have been load shedding. So it's actually about securing energy supply in both directions. The connection point in Victoria is the Loy Yang substation, the Loy Yang A and B power station, largest power station in Victoria. We have then the converter station, where we convert the 500 kV AC into 400 kV DC. We then have 300 kilometres across Bass Strait, and the cable is buried, with the exception of roughly a 3 kilometre portion off the coast of Tasmania. This is what carries the 400 kV DC. This cable is actually bundled with two other cables, the 12 core fibre optic and a metallic return. It's a braided cable that can carry up to 25,000 volts.
So we go from the rectifier to the inverter, and that creates then the flow of electrons, and then back again through the return cable, and we create the full circuit.
The path was selected to try and avoid areas of high biological value, and that particularly meant hard rocky reef areas. The other advantage of avoiding those was that it allowed a technique called wet jetting, and this just involves forcing a high pressure stream of water onto the muddy, sandy seafloor, opening up a trench which you then could lay the cable directly into.
This has not been possible in Cook Strait simply because the tides are shifting so much sediment. The cable has been laid on the seabed, and the cable has been designed specifically to meet those rigorous conditions.
Because of the nature of Cook Strait, the cables do get moved around.
A bit more of a scouring effect seen at the beginning of this free span, but once again, no sign of any damage.
At any given time, you'll see sand and rocks cover the cable, and then it might be minutes later the cable was exposed again.
You're getting powerful tides, you're getting powerful winds, you get swell from the Southern Ocean crashing through the strait, and you get occasionally earthquakes. So it is probably one of the most vigorous marine settings there are.
Seabed is becoming rougher.
It's extremely rugged and a real testament to the cable manufacturers.
The modern cables are basically chemically inert. There have been concerns expressed about the electromagnetic fields and their potential to affect organisms.
To address these concerns, the electromagnetic fields generated by the Basslink cable were thoroughly investigated by an independent review panel.
The Bass Strait Environmental Review Committee was formed following an extensive 3-year inquiry into the possible economic, social and environmental effects of laying the Basslink cable. 3 governments were involved, our national federal government and then 2 state governments. There was a recommendation that an independent committee should be established to review the effects of laying and operating the cable and to report on whether or not the effects agreed with the ones that were predicted at the inquiry stage. This was a process established by the 3 governments and the fishing industry working collaboratively. There was one other published study which had looked at the magnetic fields that surrounded the operating cable. They'd used the inclination of compass needles to map the extent of the field. We did a much more comprehensive survey in which we studied the actual magnetic field intensity, and we mapped, I think for the first time, the field surrounding an operating cable. Some fish are very sensitive to those electric and magnetic fields, and there was an initial community concern that that might affect movement of fish and animals such as whales. But the effects are so localised that in fact we don't believe there's a significant impact. We engaged commercial consultants to do studies of the ecological effects of the cable. On the Victorian side, where there are very strong longshore drift currents, the cable path basically had disappeared within 12 months. The Tasmanian side was quite a different proposition because there was a basalt reef that extended about 2 kilometres. across the shelf, and the designers of the cable decided that they would lay the cable directly onto the reef and protect it with a metallic half-shell pipe. But again, over a period of about 5 years, we saw the half pipe get colonised by the same sorts of organisms that lived on the reef either side.
When you look at some of the HVDC cables around, they've become encrusted with organisms soon after their deployment.
Within 12 months, over a large part of the cable length, we had lost all evidence for it.
Unlike submarine telecommunications cables, an industry that enjoys the benefits of generally interchangeable technologies and a shared fleet of maintenance ships, each power cable system is largely unique, with specialised personnel, vessels, and equipment needed to conduct repairs.
The fibre optic network is the backbone of communications for the globe. But from a power cable perspective, we have a completely different set of requirements. The infrastructure is so much more expensive. Basslink joined the ICPC in 2005, and I was lucky enough to join the executive committee in 2007. And what's been really good is seeing the ICPC pulling together, and it's become one body that represents both submarine telecoms cables and submarine power cables.
The supply of electricity is vital to consumers, but there is usually no system redundancy in the case of power cable faults. Power cable operators are therefore committed to protecting their investments.
Basslink has from day one taken a very proactive approach with the fishing industry. We identified all the shark fishermen and all the scallop fishermen in the region. We went through a process of anchor swaps. The traditional anchors were high impact, low hold anchors, so they dig into the surface. And we spent quite a lot of time, effort and money on researching what was a better anchor, and we came up with a low impact, high hold anchor, completely different shape.
In the early days before we patrolled the Cook Strait, there were times that we suspect that there were anchors that had come in contact with the cables and moved the cables. There's some indications of some damage.
Protection to the Cook Strait power cables has been enhanced by the creation of a cable protection zone. And there are not many of those in the world, but this is a legal entity that protects the cables from damage by passing vessels.
It's actually illegal to fish or anchor in that zone. Well, you've got a company, Seaworks, that are engaged full-time, 365 days a year, that patrol the Cook Strait cable protection zone. It's a vital link for New Zealand, and we need to ensure that it's protected.
When Basslink became live in 2006, it was the longest submarine power cable in the world, 300 kilometres, never been done. 2 years later, you've got the Northern Edge project, which is 590 kilometres. You've got the Icelandic generators looking at building a cable from Iceland to the UK. Now that would be over 1,000 kilometres.
Depending on final routes, submarine power cables from energy-rich nations such as Iceland could potentially pass into international waters beyond the national jurisdiction of coastal nations. However, these interconnectors, like all international cables, will be protected by the rights afforded to cables under international law, enshrined in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea.
The closure in some nations of nuclear power plants have meant that they've had to turn to something else, wind turbines, and Europe has promulgated some major farms around the UK and Denmark. Much of the renewables in terms of wind turbines have been offshore. That has meant a boom in the production of submarine power cables.
And offshore wind, started quite close to the coastline, and now it's getting further and further away. And as technology advances, we're looking at things like tidal energy.
And this has been looked at in Cook Strait over here, in placement of a turbine on the seabed, and that generates power. Elsewhere, people are looking at wave generation schemes. But at the moment, it's early days.
Within the next 10, 15 years, there are going to be so many HVDC projects.
At the same time, the physical responses of the ocean and atmosphere to ongoing global warming will put these same cable systems at increasing risk.
With regards to climate change, one of the immediate concerns for the industry is rising sea level. And we saw this very well in Hurricane Sandy. We had obviously rising sea levels, but on top of that we packed the punch from hurricane force winds which piled the water up, sent them through Long Island Sound and created a storm surge of about 4 metres. That was a wake-up call. They are now taking active steps to protect the cables that come ashore.
the mainland electrons arrive at 4 Mile Bluff to service demand in parched Tasmania. 4 years later, in 2012, the drought has broken and the Tasmanian reservoirs are finally being replenished. With Tasmania again generating more power than its own requirements, the interconnector now reverses transmission direction, delivering clean, renewable power to demand centres in Victoria. Submarine power cable systems like Basslink have proven to be critical social and economic interconnectors and will become increasingly important in the decades to come.